The snow was falling heavily on that Christmas Eve, covering everything around with a white blanket. The forest seemed like an endless place, dark and silent, with the biting cold that made George's hands shake even inside his pockets. He was lost, completely lost. Every step was a battle against the snow that reached almost up to his knees, and the wind showed no mercy, throwing small flakes in his face, as if nature itself wanted to drive him away. "Why was I so stubborn?" he murmured to himself, holding a weak lantern that barely lit the way. His breathing was heavy, getting harder to control. George felt the weight of his 72 years more than ever. He had left home just to get firewood, thinking it would be quick, thinking he had everything under control. But now he was lost in the middle of the forest, alone, in the cruelest cold he had ever faced. Since his wife, Margaret, passed away, George had avoided Christmas. He didn't want to think about parties or happy memories. This time of year always seemed like a reminder of everything he had lost. And this Christmas was no different. He just wanted to go unnoticed, as if he didn't exist. Why decorate the house if there's no one to see it? He thought. And because of that, he didn't ask anyone for help when he needed to get firewood. He thought, as always, that he could manage it on his own. But now, with the cold taking over his body and the darkness growing, he began to wonder, would anyone miss me if I didn't come home today? Suddenly, he heard something, a different sound in the midst of that eerie silence. A bark. George stopped, his breath caught for a moment. He looked around, squinting his eyes, trying to see anything in the dark. Then he heard it again, louder this time. Another bark, coming from somewhere nearby. A dog? He whispered, intrigued. Before he could think much, he saw a shadow moving between the trees. The weak light from the lantern revealed a dog. It was big, with thick fur that protected it from the cold, and bright eyes that seemed to watch him intently. The dog stood still for a few seconds, staring at George, as if it knew exactly what was going on. "Where did you come from, huh?" George said, his voice trembling. He didn't know if it was from fear or from the cold. The dog barked again, then turned and started walking. But it didn't leave. It looked back at George, as if to say, "Follow me." George hesitated. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to stay still. He was tired. He was freezing. And above all, he wasn't sure he could trust it. But at the same time, something inside him told him that this dog was his only chance, that it was here for a reason. With effort, George took the first step, then the second. The dog kept walking, but always looked back, making sure George was following. "All right, buddy, I guess I don't have a choice," George said, trying to hide the desperation he felt. As he walked, George noticed something strange. Even though he was weak and tired, there was something about that presence that made him keep going. As if, suddenly, he wasn't alone anymore. He didn't know it yet, but that encounter would be the beginning of a journey that would not only save his life, but also bring him back something he had lost long ago. Hope in the Christmas spirit. The snow kept falling, covering George's steps almost instantly as he made them. It was as if the forest wanted to erase any sign of his presence, leaving him even more alone. But he wasn't alone anymore, not completely. The dog was walking ahead, with firm steps, as if it knew exactly where it was going. George tried to ignore the pain in his legs and the uncomfortable feeling of the cold that seemed to be winning the battle against his endurance. "You must know a warm place, right, buddy?" he said, his voice weakened. The dog stopped for a moment and looked at him. There was no denying it. Those eyes were different. They shone in a way that George couldn't explain, almost as if the dog could understand every word he said. George's thoughts started to wander as he followed it. The silence of the forest was broken only by the sound of the wind and the rustling of branches heavy with snow. He thought about his house, empty and dark, just the way he had left it. For George, Christmas had become just another day. No laughter, no songs, no smell of gingerbread cookies that Margaret always made sure to prepare. Margaret loved Christmas, he said quietly, as if telling a secret to the dog. She made the house feel like a piece of heaven. The lights, the decorations, even the candles had a special smell. The smell of home. George stopped for a moment, realizing his eyes were misty. He didn't allow himself to feel these things often. It was easier to hide, to pretend those memories didn't exist. But now, in that cold, with a strange dog guiding his steps, it was as if all those memories were waiting for him, ready to overwhelm him all at once. After she was gone, I just stopped, he confessed. He didn't know exactly who he was talking to. Maybe to himself, maybe to the dog. The dog barked softly, interrupting his thoughts, and started walking again. George shook his head and followed. "You're lucky you don't have to worry about these things," he said, trying to force a smile. "You just need to worry about food and shelter. You don't need to think about the past. You don't need to remember who you lost." As he walked, George's mind kept revisiting old moments. He remembered when he and Margaret would spend the entire afternoon together in the kitchen, preparing the Christmas dinner. Her laughter still felt so real. The way she always used to say, "No matter how cold it is outside, George, in here it's always warm." He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block the memory, but it was useless. What once was a source of comfort now felt like a weight he couldn't carry. The dog stopped again and looked at him, as if waiting for George to hurry up. I know. I'm coming," he said, even though his legs were shaking from exhaustion. As he followed the animal, something began to change. George noticed that, even though he was tired, the cold seemed less cruel. Maybe it was the idea of having company. Or maybe it was the fact that he now had a direction, a purpose, however small. He watched the dog's confident steps and couldn't shake the feeling that there was something special about this animal. It wasn't just a dog lost in the forest. It was more than that. George didn't know how to explain it, but deep down, he felt that this encounter wasn't by chance. "You know, boy, if it were anyone else in my place, they probably would have given up by now," George said, his voice strained by the effort of walking. "But something tells me you showed up for a reason. And honestly, I'm not someone who believes much in these things. But for some reason, you make me want to believe." The dog wagged its tail, a subtle movement, but one that seemed to have a greater meaning, as if it were agreeing. George let out a short laugh, but a genuine one, for the first time in a long time. "You're really something. But you know, strange or not, you're the only thing keeping me standing right now." The wind seemed to have died down a bit, but the night was still dark and cold. George knew he would need more than just willpower to keep going. He looked at the dog one more time. "All right, buddy, I'm with you. Just don't leave me, okay?" He kept walking, each step a little harder than the last. But now there was something different in George. It wasn't just the hope of finding shelter. It was more than that. It was the feeling that, perhaps, he still had something to fight for. He didn't know what awaited him, but somehow he felt that this dog was showing him the way, not just out of the forest, but also to something he thought he would never find again. The true meaning of Christmas. George kept following the dog, even though each step was harder than the last. The snow seemed to be getting heavier, and the cold wind cut through his skin like blades. He started to wonder if he was really heading in the right direction, or just prolonging the inevitable. But then, every time despair threatened to take over, the dog would look back at him with that same steady and almost reassuring gaze. George tried not to think about the cold, the exhaustion, or the fear that now felt almost as strong as the pain in his legs. He tried to focus on the dog, on that strangely comforting presence. Still, the doubts consumed him. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, breathless, but the dog kept walking. George stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath. He looked around at the darkness, feeling the weight of his choices. All he had wanted was to get firewood, and now he was here, lost in the middle of a forest, blindly trusting an animal that seemed just as out of place as he was. The idea seemed absurd, and for a moment, George thought about giving up. "Maybe it's easier to stop here," he murmured to himself, the exhaustion spilling over in his voice. He looked at the dog, who had now stopped, waiting. "You don't understand, do you?" George said, almost irritated. "I'm old, tired, and maybe no one really cares if I come back or not." The dog barked, a short sound, almost as if disagreeing. It took 2 steps toward George and wagged its tail lightly, as if to say, "You can't stop now." George let out a heavy sigh. He knew that line of thinking wouldn't take him anywhere. And yet, it was hard to ignore the years of loneliness, the absence of Margaret, the weight of being invisible to the world around him. "I used to be someone, you know," he said, speaking more to the emptiness than to the dog. "I had a family. I had a reason to get up every morning." The memories came back like a wave. He remembered the first Christmas he spent with Margaret. The little house they lived in was simple, but full of love. He remembered how she laughed as she unwrapped the presents, always more excited than he was. "You're like a kid at Christmas," he used to say, and she'd reply, "Because I believe in the magic, George. You should too." The wind blew hard, pulling George back to reality. He rubbed his hands, trying to regain some feeling in his fingers. The dog barked again, a little louder this time, as if it wanted to pull him out of those thoughts. All right, I'm going," George said, taking another step forward. But the walk soon presented another challenge. The snow was getting thicker, and he began to notice that the ground ahead was sloped. Climbing that hill seemed impossible in his state. "You're kidding with me, aren't you?" he asked the dog, who had already started climbing. "I can barely put one foot in front of the other, and you want me to climb this?" The dog stopped halfway up the hill, looked at George, and barked. There was something in that sound that almost seemed encouraging. "You really think I can do it?" George asked, with a weak laugh. He looked at the ground for a moment, considering if it was worth the effort. But deep down, something inside him told him he had to keep going. Even if it was hard, even if it seemed impossible. With difficulty, George began to climb. Each step felt like a test of endurance, and his muscles screamed with every movement. But the dog stayed there, waiting patiently whenever George needed to stop, and resuming its walk as soon as he managed to move a little further. As he climbed, George realized he was fighting not just against the snow or the incline. He was fighting against himself, against the voices in his head that told him he had no purpose anymore, that it was easier to quit than to try. And somehow, by following the dog, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just hope, it was determination. "You're stubborn, you know that?" he said, in a hoarse voice, but with a tone that almost sounded like gratitude. The dog barked one last time before reaching the top of the hill. George, on the other hand, stopped for a moment to catch his breath. He looked up, seeing the dog standing against the night sky, like a protective shadow waiting for him. "All right, boy. One more step. Just one more step." And with effort, George finally reached the top. He bent over, placing his hands on his knees, and took a deep breath, feeling the relief of having overcome that obstacle. But as he lifted his eyes, something unexpected caught his attention. There was a light. Faint, distant, but clear. A light that blinked, as if signaling for him to keep going. The dog looked at him and barked again, as if to say, "That's where we need to go." George felt a shiver run down his spine. But this time it wasn't from the cold. He didn't know what he would find in that direction, but one thing was certain. He couldn't stop now. George stood at the top of the hill, his heart pounding as his eyes stayed fixed on the distant light. It blinked in a rhythmic pattern, like a lighthouse guiding a lost ship through the darkness. He squinted, trying to see better, but the exhaustion made everything appear as a blur. The dog, on the other hand, was calm. It looked at George, wagged its tail lightly, and barked in a low tone, almost as if it were saying, "Don't stop now. You can do this." George took a deep breath and tried to regain control. He wasn't the type to give up easily, but the last few years had worn something inside him down, and it was more than just his body. He straightened up and looked at the light again. It seemed so far away, but something about it made his heart beat differently. He looked at the dog and murmured, "All right, boy, let's go." As he descended the hill, George started to think about how everything in life seemed so much simpler before. He grew up in a small town in rural Ohio, where Christmas was always the most special time of the year. He and his parents used to spend weeks decorating the house, cutting pine branches, and hanging lights that sparkled like stars. His mother always said, "Christmas isn't about the presents, George. It's about the love we put into everything we do." He carried those words with him throughout much of his life. When he met Margaret, he knew, almost immediately, that she was the love his mother had always mentioned. She shared the same passion for Christmas, for life, for the simple act of creating happy memories. They had a habit of hosting large dinners on Christmas Eve, inviting friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had nowhere to spend the holiday. But the last few years had been cruel. Margaret was diagnosed with a serious illness, and despite all attempts at treatment, she passed away one January morning, leaving George alone in the home they had turned into a sanctuary. After that, he shut himself off from the world. Christmas, which had once been his favorite time of year, became a constant reminder of the emptiness she left behind. He stopped decorating, stopped cooking, stopped believing in the magic Margaret always swore existed. As he walked behind the dog, George realized he had spent so much time looking to the past that he had forgotten how to live in the present. He sighed deeply, feeling the weight of those memories. "You know, boy," he said, as the dog glanced at him, "I used to be someone who believed in Christmas, who believed in people. But now, well, now I'm just someone trying to survive." The dog stopped for a moment and stared at George, its eyes shining in the dark. There was something in the way it looked at him, as if it understood everything George was saying. "It's funny," George continued, rubbing his hands to try and warm them up. "When you get old, it feels like the world starts to forget about you. Or maybe it's you who starts hiding from it." George paused, looking at the dog again. "But you didn't leave me alone, did you? Even when I thought no one else cared?" The dog barked softly, as if agreeing. When they reached the bottom of the hill, George felt the fatigue take over again. The cold was relentless, but he knew he couldn't stop. The light was still ahead, blinking, waiting for him. He looked at the dog and, for the first time in a long time, felt something different. It wasn't exactly hope, but it was a beginning. "All right, boy," he said, with renewed determination in his voice. "Let's see what's waiting for us there." As they walked together, George realized that this dog, who he didn't even know where it had come from, wasn't just company. It was a reminder of something George had forgotten. Sometimes, help comes from the least expected places, and life can surprise us if we have the courage to keep moving forward. George's steps were slow but steady. The cold was relentless, but there was something that kept him going. The light ahead was like a silent promise. It blinked rhythmically, like a signal saying, "Come, I'm waiting for you." The dog led the way confidently, but George couldn't shake the doubts that started to linger in his mind. "What if it's nothing? What if I'm just fooling myself?" he murmured to himself. The sound of the wind seemed to mock his questions, but the dog kept going, ignoring George's hesitation. As they got closer, George realized that the light wasn't as far away as it seemed. It came from a cabin, simple but with a welcoming appearance. The windows were decorated with Christmas lights that blinked in warm shades of red and gold, contrasting with the coldness of the night. For a moment, George felt a tightness in his chest. That scene looked like something out of a distant memory, from a time when he believed places like this only existed in Christmas stories. "You've been bringing me here all along, haven't you?" George said to the dog, who had now stopped in front of the cabin door. The animal wagged its tail lightly but remained silent. George hesitated, looking at the door. Why was he so nervous? It was just a cabin. Maybe it was an empty, abandoned place, but at least it would protect him from the cold. Or maybe there was someone inside, someone willing to help him. Still, he felt the weight of uncertainty. It was as if entering that cabin meant something bigger than just warming up. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the last time he had been in a place lit up and full of life. It was years ago, when Margaret was still alive. They used to spend Christmas Eve surrounded by friends and neighbors, sharing laughs, stories, and delicious food. The smell of cinnamon and ginger still seemed so real in his memory. But now he was just a lonely man, knocking on the door of something that seemed too good to be true. "All right, boy, let's see what's waiting for us," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. With trembling hands, George touched the doorknob. It was warm, as if it were saying that he was welcome. He slowly pushed the door open, and what he saw on the other side almost made his heart stop. The cabin wasn't empty. There was a small room lit by a gentle fire in the fireplace, crackling and warming the space in a way that almost seemed magical. The table in the center was covered with a red cloth, adorned with candles and pinecone arrangements. Beside the fireplace, a small Christmas tree, perfectly decorated, glowed with lights that blinked softly. But what caught his attention the most was the presence of two people. A couple, appearing to be just over 50 years old, sat near the fireplace. They looked at George with surprise, but there was no suspicion in their eyes. It was pure curiosity, and perhaps a touch of compassion. "My God, you're freezing," said the woman, quickly standing up. She had a warm face that reminded George of someone, although he didn't know exactly who. "Please, come in," said the man, extending his hand to help him through the door. George hesitated, but before he could respond, the dog ran past his legs and entered the cabin as if it were its own home. It lay down near the fireplace, curling up peacefully as if its mission had been completed. Is the dog yours?" George asked, still not believing what was happening. The couple exchanged confused glances. "Ours? No, we thought he was yours," said the man, frowning. George looked at the dog, who now seemed completely at ease, and felt a lump in his throat. Something about that moment was so surreal that he almost started laughing. "Well, I guess he's the reason I'm here," George said with a half smile. "And we're happy for that," said the woman, gently touching George's arm. "Come, sit down. Let's warm you up. And there's hot soup in the kitchen. It's the least we can offer." George nodded, feeling more relieved than he had imagined. He followed the couple into the cabin, still not fully understanding how he had ended up there, but grateful to finally be in a safe place. He looked back one more time, observing the dog by the fireplace. "You're really something, boy. Thank you." As the door closed, George felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The warmth of a place that felt more than just welcoming. It felt like home. George slowly sat down in the chair next to the fireplace. The warmth of the flames was like an embrace, pushing away the cold that seemed to have infiltrated even his bones. He rubbed his hands, trying to regain some feeling in his fingers, while looking around. The cabin was small, but cozy, with the scent of burned wood mixed with the aroma of something delicious coming from the kitchen. The woman soon returned, carrying a steaming bowl of soup and a mug of hot tea. "Here, drink this. It'll help warm you up," she said, with a welcoming smile. George took the bowl with still trembling hands. "Thank you. I don't even know what to say. You saved me." "No need to thank us," said the man, sitting in an armchair nearby. "The important thing is that you're here now." George looked at them, confused and still a little hesitant. "But how did you know? How did you know I was out there?" The woman exchanged a quick look with her husband before answering. "We didn't know. You were the one who showed up at the door. Or rather, I think it was him." She pointed to the dog, who was lying by the fireplace, his eyes half closed, as if at peace. George looked at the dog, then back at the couple. Something about the whole situation felt surreal. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped. How could he explain that he had been lost in the middle of the forest and that this dog, who no one seemed to know, had led him here? I think this dog doesn't belong to anyone," George said, finally, in a quiet voice. "He just showed up, found me in the middle of the snow and, well, brought me here." The couple fell silent for a moment, processing what he had said. The man was the first to speak. "That's not something we see every day. But sometimes, miracles happen, especially at Christmas." George let out a short laugh, almost in disbelief. "Miracles? I've never been the kind of person to believe in things like that." "Maybe it's time to start," said the woman, with a kind smile. As George ate the soup, he felt the warmth spread through his body. But at the same time, something else started to happen. He couldn't ignore the feeling that this moment wasn't just luck. It was something bigger. He looked at the couple, feeling a growing curiosity. "Do you do this all the time? I mean, open your doors to people like me?" The woman smiled. "Actually, yes. My name is Clara, and this is my husband, Sam. We've lived here for years, and we've always believed that Christmas is a time to share. We don't always know who might show up, but our doors are always open. It's our way of keeping the spirit of the season alive," her husband added. "And you're not the first one to show up needing help. We don't know what leads us to people, but it seems to always happen at the right time." George listened carefully, feeling a mix of gratitude and discomfort. He wasn't used to depending on anyone, let alone accepting kindness from strangers. But there was something about Clara and Sam that made everything feel right. "I used to believe in this kind of thing, you know," said George, looking at the empty bowl in his hands. "My wife, Margaret, she was exactly like you. Always believed that Christmas was a magical time, full of miracles. But after she passed, I lost that. Lost everything, really." Clara placed her hand on George's shoulder. "I'm so sorry for your loss. It must have been very difficult for you." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. She loved Christmas. It was the best part of the year for her. And for a while, it was for me too. But now, he couldn't finish the sentence. Sam, who had been listening quietly, said calmly, "Sometimes, we forget how much this season can give us. It's not just about presents or parties. It's about finding something we lost, something that connects us back to life." George sat in silence, reflecting on those words. He looked at the dog once more. The animal was still, but its eyes were bright, watching everything as if it was waiting for something. "Maybe you're right," said George, finally. "Maybe this dog is my little miracle. And maybe I'm here for a reason." Clara smiled again, her gaze warm like the fire that was warming the room. "Well, whatever the reason, we're glad you're here. Now, how about some bread to go with that tea?" George gave a slight smile, something he hadn't done in a long time. "I'll take it. Thank you." "Really?" As Clara went to the kitchen, George looked back at the Christmas tree lights. Something inside him was starting to change. He couldn't explain exactly what it was, but it was as if this place, these people, and even this dog were reigniting something he thought he had lost forever. George sat by the fireplace, his hands extended toward the warmth of the flames. The surroundings were perfect, cozy, comfortable, a refuge amidst the storm outside. But inside, he still felt a weight. As safe as he was there, something bothered him, like a persistent voice whispering that things weren't as simple as they seemed. He looked at the dog, who was still lying by the fireplace. The animal seemed to be resting, but its eyes, bright and alert, remained fixed on George. It was as if the dog knew something that George didn't, like there was more to this journey than just finding shelter. Clara returned with a plate of warm bread and placed it on the table. "Here you go, George. I'm sure some fresh bread will help you feel better." George nodded, thanking her. He broke off a piece of bread and took a bite, but even with the delicious taste, he couldn't fully relax. Sam, who was sitting in an armchair nearby, noticed George's unease. "Is everything all right?" Sam asked, in a calm tone. George paused, reflecting on what he really felt. I don't know. I mean, I'm really grateful for all of this. You don't even know me, and yet you opened your doors to me. But I don't know why I feel so out of place." Clara approached and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's natural. You've been through a lot, George. The cold, the loneliness, it takes a toll on us. But here, you're safe. You don't need to worry." Although Clara's words were comforting, George couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. He looked back at the dog. The animal had gotten up and was standing by the door, staring at him as if it expected George to understand something important. "He's restless," George said, pointing at the dog. "It's like he knows that this isn't over." Sam looked at the dog, then back at George, and gave a slight smile. "Sometimes, animals sense things we can't. Maybe he's trying to tell you something. Maybe he feels like you still have a path to follow." George let out a short, almost skeptical laugh. "A path? To where? I barely made it here. If it weren't for him, I'd probably still be lost in the snow." Clara sat next to George, with an understanding look. "Maybe you came here for a reason. Have you thought about that? Sometimes, life takes us places we never imagined, just to show us something we need to remember." George fell silent for a moment, reflecting on what she had said. He knew there was something special about that night, but he still couldn't fully understand it. The dog suddenly barked, breaking the silence, and began to scratch lightly at the door. "I think he wants to go out," George said, furrowing his brow. Sam stood up and walked to the door. "Well, if he wants to go, we won't stop him. But maybe you should go with him. It seems like he still has something to show you." George looked at Sam, confused. You want me to go back out there? After all this? Sam shrugged, with a gentle smile. I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to, but I think you've already realized that this dog isn't here by accident. Clara nodded in agreement. George, sometimes when we think everything's been resolved, life gives us a little push to go a bit further. Maybe that's what he's trying to do. George looked at the door, at the dog, and finally at Clara and Sam. He felt a mix of fear and curiosity. Something inside him told him that if he stayed there, he would be safe, but incomplete. On the other hand, there was a part of him starting to believe that following the dog could lead him to something greater, something he didn't even know he was looking for. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of his decision. All right, he said, with a firm voice. If he wants me to follow him, I will. But I hope he knows what he's doing. Clara smiled, with an encouraging look. I'm sure he knows. Sam opened the door, and the cold air flooded the cabin. The dog stepped outside, looking at George as if it were waiting for him to follow. George took a deep breath, feeling the cold again, but also something new. A determination he hadn't felt in a long time. All right, boy, let's see what you've got to show me. With that, he took the first step outside, closing the door behind him. The snow was still falling, but now, with the dog leading once again, George felt like he was walking towards something that could change everything. The cold wind hit George's face as soon as he stepped out of the cabin. For a moment, he almost wanted to turn back, but the dog didn't hesitate. It descended the snow-covered steps and began walking toward the forest, only looking back once to make sure George was following. All right, boy, I'm out here now. Don't leave me now, George murmured, adjusting the scarf around his neck. The cold seemed even more intense than before, but there was something about the dog that gave George a determination he hadn't felt in years. The presence of that animal was strangely comforting, as if he was being guided by something or someone who knew exactly where they were going. As he walked, George thought about Clara's words. Sometimes life takes us to places we need to remember. He didn't know exactly what he needed to remember, but something inside him told him that following the dog was important. You're quite the curious one, aren't you? He said to the dog, who quickly turned its head as if it was listening. George smiled, almost without meaning to. I used to have a dog, you know, when I was a kid. A German shepherd named Max. He was as stubborn as you, always pulling me when he thought I was going in the wrong direction. The dog barked softly, as if responding, and George laughed. It was the first time he had laughed genuinely in a long time. Maybe you're like him. Max always knew what I needed, even when I didn't. As they walked deeper into the forest, George began to notice that the terrain was changing. The trees, once dense and dark, were now more spaced out, allowing small beams of light to cut through the darkness. The snow felt lighter, and the wind sounded softer. Where are you taking me, boy? George asked, more to himself than to the dog. He realized that despite the fatigue, there was something different inside him. A lightness he hadn't felt in years. It was as if with each step, he was moving away not only from the cold, but also from the sadness he had been carrying. Suddenly, the dog stopped and looked at him. George also stopped, surprised by the unexpected pause. What now? He asked, but the dog simply barked softly, as if saying, wait. George followed the dog's gaze and saw something that made him swallow hard. Not far ahead, there was a clearing, and in the center of it, an old tree decorated with lights. It was like a scene taken straight from a Christmas card. Simple ornaments hung from the branches, and a small star rested at the top. He slowly walked toward the tree, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. As he got closer, he noticed a small sign at the base of the tree, partially covered by the snow. He crouched down, carefully brushing the snow away, and read the words engraved there. For all those who need a little hope. George felt a lump form in his throat. He stayed there, kneeling, looking at the sign and the tree, as old memories began to flood in. He thought of Margaret, how she always said that Christmas was the perfect time for a fresh start, to find joy even in the hardest moments. He looked at the dog, who was calmly sitting beside him, as if waiting for his reaction. This is your doing, isn't it? Said George, his voice choking. You brought me here because you needed to remind me of all this. The dog didn't move, but there was something in its eyes that seemed to convey understanding. George smiled, even as tears ran down his face. "You're really stubborn, boy, but I think I needed someone like you." He stood up, taking a deep breath, and looked around. The clearing was silent, but somehow it felt alive. The glow of the tree reflected on the snow around, creating a scene that George knew he would never forget. He reached into his pocket and took out a small photo he always carried with him. It was a photo of Margaret, smiling, taken at a Christmas years ago. He looked at it for a moment before carefully placing it beside the sign. "I hope you like the view, darling," he said, with a smile full of longing, but also peace. The dog barked softly, breaking the silence, and George looked at him. "I guess it's time to go back, huh?" The dog wagged its tail and began walking back toward the forest, stopping only to make sure George was following. As they walked back together toward the cabin, George felt something change inside him. He still missed Margaret, and he always would, but at that moment, he understood something he had ignored for a long time. Life didn't have to stop because of his pain. He could still find joy, hope, and even a little magic, if he was willing to look in the right places. As George and the dog walked back along the trail in the forest, the air seemed different. It was still cold, but something inside him had changed. The clearing with the decorated tree had awakened memories, but it had also planted something new, a small sprout of hope. He didn't know exactly why the tree was there or who decorated it, but it seemed to speak directly to him. Every step he took felt lighter, and for the first time in years, George began to realize what he was truly feeling. It wasn't just longing for Margaret. It was the feeling that, without her, he had lost not only her company but also a part of himself. The dog continued ahead, leading with the same determination, but now George wasn't following him out of necessity. He felt like he was being guided by something bigger. "You're a good guide, boy. I think I'm starting to understand what you're trying to show me," he said, almost as if admitting something to himself. The cabin appeared between the trees, its lights flickering softly, inviting. George's heart quickened. He didn't know why, but something told him there was more waiting for him there. As he reached the door, the dog stopped, looked at him, and barked as if to say, "Come in." George slowly opened the door. The warmth of the fire enveloped him again, but this time, he noticed something different. Clara and Sam were at the table, setting the dishes, but now there was something new. The table was full of Christmas dishes: pies, cookies, a bowl of punch, and a platter of turkey that emitted an irresistible aroma. Clara looked at George with a warm smile. "Right on time. We were starting to wonder if you'd come back. You made all this while I was out?" George asked, surprised. Clara laughed softly. "Not everything, of course. But, this time of year always inspires us to do something special." Sam raised a glass of punch. "Christmas is about sharing, George. No matter how hard the world seems out there, there's always something we can do to make things better, even if it's just a meal." George looked at the table and felt a tightness in his chest. The scene looked like one of those Christmases he and Margaret used to have. But instead of sadness, he felt something different. A desire to be part of something again, to connect. He looked at Clara and Sam, then at the dog, who had peacefully curled up by the fire. I don't even know what to say. This is so much." "Then just say you accept," Clara said, with a soft smile. George smiled back, but before sitting down, something caught his attention. By the window next to the Christmas tree, there was a small ornament hanging. It was a simple red heart, perfectly positioned to catch the light. He walked over and touched the glass, as if wanting to make sure it was real. Margaret had an ornament exactly like that, he said to himself. She loved hanging it at the center of the tree every year. Clara, now standing next to him, placed a hand on his shoulder. Maybe it's a sign that she's still with you in some way. George closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the tears gather. He didn't say anything, but he nodded slowly. Then, he turned and walked to the table, sitting down for the first time with a smile that wasn't forced. "Well, if I'm going to join this dinner, I guess I need to bring something too," he said, pulling a small piece of paper from his pocket. It was a handwritten recipe, with firm but aged letters. This was Margaret's favorite recipe: gingerbread cookies. I never could make them like she did, but I think it's the right time to try." Clara smiled, carefully taking the paper. "Then of course, we'll make them. This is a dinner for new beginnings, after all." As they began to work together, George realized that the pain he had carried for so long was starting to feel more bearable. He felt something new forming inside him, a desire to keep going, to participate, to create new memories. By the fire, the dog watched everything in silence. Its eyes sparkled as if it knew its mission was complete. As George worked alongside Clara in the kitchen, mixing the gingerbread dough, he felt a strange mix of emotions. It was comforting to be involved in something so simple, but at the same time, a wave of doubt began to rise. He had never tried to recreate Margaret's recipe since she passed. For him, it was like stirring up a part of his life that had been frozen in time, untouched because it hurt too much to revisit. "You seem focused," Clara commented, with an encouraging smile. George looked at her, hesitating for a moment before responding. "I just hope they turn out good. Margaret was so good at this. Everything she made was perfect. I could never get it right." Clara placed a hand on his arm and gently squeezed. "It doesn't have to be perfect, George. Sometimes, the most important thing isn't the outcome, but the act of trying. You're bringing something of her into this moment, and that's already special." Clara's words touched him more deeply than he expected. He took a deep breath and continued working on the recipe, but he couldn't shake the thoughts that were haunting him. What if I mess this up? What if this isn't enough to honor her? As the cookies baked in the oven, George stepped away and sat down in a chair by the fire. He looked at the dog, who watched him with its ever-watchful eyes. It was almost as if the animal could sense the emotional storm happening inside him. "Why is this so hard?" George asked the dog, speaking more to himself. "She always said Christmas was for making happy memories. But now, every time I think of her, all I can remember is how things ended." The dog tilted its head slightly, as if listening attentively. George sighed and closed his eyes. He thought about the last conversation he had with Margaret when she was in the hospital. "You need to keep going, George," she had said, her voice weak but full of conviction. "Promise me you won't let the world erase you, that you'll find a way to smile again, to live." At the time, he had just shaken his head, unable to answer. How could he promise something like that when she was slipping away? Now, sitting there, George felt the weight of that unfulfilled promise. He had shut himself off from everything and everyone since Margaret's death. The man she had loved, the man who believed in Christmas and the magic of life, had disappeared, buried beneath years of sorrow. "I'm not the same man," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "I disappointed her. I let the pain take over. How can I start over now?" Clara entered the room at that moment, interrupting his thoughts. "The cookies are ready," she said, with enthusiasm. George tried to smile, but he felt it was more of a reflex than a genuine emotion. He got up and walked into the kitchen, where the familiar smell of ginger and cinnamon enveloped him. It was so much like the Christmases he and Margaret used to share that he almost felt he could hear her humming as she worked alongside him. Clara placed the cookies on a plate and looked at George with expectation. "How about you be the first to try?" He took a cookie, looking at it like it was a relic. He bit into it slowly, closing his eyes as the taste spread. It was sweet, slightly spicy, and imperfect, but, surprisingly, it didn't bother him. He opened his eyes and smiled faintly. "They're not exactly the same, but I think she would approve." Clara smiled back. Of course she would. She'd be proud of you for trying. George looked at the plate of cookies and felt something new. It wasn't complete happiness, but it was the beginning of something. Maybe a thread of hope that he could still reconnect with the life Margaret always wanted him to have. He picked up another cookie and took it to the table, where Sam was already eating, chuckling softly. The dog, as always, watched in silence, but this time, George sensed something different in its gaze. It wasn't just observing, it was approval. Sitting at the table, surrounded by new company and a piece of the past recreated, George began to understand. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could honor Margaret in the best way possible, by living the life she always wanted for him. As the cookies were shared and laughter began to fill the space, George felt something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the spirit of Christmas. It was the feeling that he could still find joy, a small step at a time. The night was quiet, but George's heart was restless. He sat near the window, watching the snow fall silently. The table was now clean, and Clara and Sam were talking quietly, giving him space to think. The dog, as always, was nearby, lying at George's feet, its constant presence offering a strange kind of comfort. Despite the warmth of the cabin and the gentle company, George felt an internal battle. The clearing with the tree, the gingerbread cookies, Clara and Sam's generosity, all of it had deeply touched him. But along with these moments came the memories. They were so vivid that they seemed to whisper in his ear, reminding him not only of what he had lost, but also of the man he used to be. He looked at the dog and sighed. "You knew this was going to happen, didn't you?" he said, his voice low and tired. The dog lifted its head and stared at him with those penetrating eyes, as if saying, "You needed this." George rubbed his face with his hands. "Why is this so hard? This whole thing about starting over, about moving forward? I know what Margaret wanted for me, but every time I try, it's like something pulls me back. Like I don't deserve to be happy without her." Clara appeared beside him, holding a cup of hot tea. "George," she said gently, handing him the cup, "can I say something?" He nodded, holding the tea but not drinking it. "I didn't know your Margaret, but by the way you talk about her, I think she must have been a wonderful person." Clara sat in a nearby chair, looking at him with eyes full of empathy. "And people like that, they never want us to stay stuck in the past. They want us to live." George shook his head, struggling against the tears that threatened to fall. "I know that. I know she wanted me to go on, but it's easier said than done." Clara smiled lightly. "Of course it is. The human heart is stubborn, and grief doesn't follow a timeline. But sometimes, we need to let ourselves feel joy again, even if it's slow." George sat in silence, absorbing her words. He looked at the tea in his hands, as if searching for answers in the steam rising from it. Sam entered the room, interrupting the moment. "Clara, can you help me with the firewood outside? The snow's getting worse." Clara nodded and gave George's shoulder a light pat before heading out with Sam. Now, he was once again alone with the dog, who continued to watch him patiently. "She makes it seem so simple," George murmured. He stood up and began walking around the room. Every corner of the cabin seemed filled with memories that weren't his, but that stirred something within him. The Christmas tree glowed softly, and beside it, there was a small shelf with photos. He approached, curious. The photos showed Clara and Sam with other people, children, young adults, older couples. In every photo, there were genuine smiles and joy. But what caught George's attention was one particular photo in the center. It was an image of Clara and Sam in front of the cabin, holding a sign that read, "Welcome. There's always room at the table." George felt a tightness in his chest. He thought about how Clara and Sam seemed genuinely happy, despite having probably faced their own losses. They had chosen to open their doors and hearts, creating a space where others could find comfort and hope. "Maybe they know something I don't," George said aloud, looking at the dog. "Maybe living isn't about forgetting, but about finding a way to carry what we've lost." The dog got up, walked over to George, and touched his leg with its nose, as if agreeing. But before George could continue his thoughts, Sam and Clara hurried back inside, their clothes covered in snow. Sam looked concerned. "George, the storm's gotten worse outside. It's getting dangerous," he said, adding more firewood to the stove to keep the cabin warm. Clara, however, looked at George with a calmer expression, but one full of meaning. Sometimes that's how life works. The storm gets worse before it gets better. George knew she wasn't just talking about the weather. He looked outside through the window, seeing the snow fall faster, and then at the dog, who was now lying down again, but with its eyes fixed on him. A storm wasn't just what was happening outside. It was what was happening inside him. But maybe, for the first time, he was ready to face it. The snow fell heavily, pounding against the cabin's windows as if the world outside wanted to get in. George was sitting at the table again, but now he felt something different. There was a tension in the air, not because of the storm, but because of what was inside him. It was as if all the conversations, memories, and small moments of the evening had been building up, pushing him toward a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. Clara approached, bringing another cup of tea. She placed it in front of George and sat down beside him, her gaze soft but full of meaning. "George, can I ask you something?" He looked at her, hesitating. "Of course. What do you think Margaret would say if she saw you now?" The question caught him off guard. He lowered his eyes to the tea, as if trying to find an answer in the hot liquid. "I don't know. I think she'd be sad. Sad that I've pulled away from everything. That I let Christmas, people, just disappear from my life." Clara tilted her head slightly. "Do you think she'd want to see you like this? Sad alone?" George slowly shook his head. "No. She always wanted me to be happy. Even in the hardest times, she always found a way to smile. I couldn't do it without her." Clara gave a slight smile and held his hand. "But now you can. It doesn't have to be perfect, George. It just needs to be sincere. And from what I see, you've already started." Her words hit something deep within him. Maybe Clara was right. Maybe Margaret didn't expect him to be the same as before, but only that he try. At that moment, the dog barked. George looked at him, who was standing by the door, staring out intently. Clara and Sam exchanged a quick glance. "Do you think he wants to go out again?" Sam asked, standing up to check. When Sam opened the door, the cold wind rushed into the cabin, and with it came a distant sound that made George stand up immediately. It was a cry, a faint sound, almost drowned out by the storm, but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" George asked, his heart racing. Clara and Sam nodded, now alert. The dog barked again, more intensely, and ran outside. George looked at Clara and Sam, hesitating only for a moment before grabbing his coat. "I'm going after him," George said. "George, it's dangerous out there," Clara warned, but there was something in his voice that made her pause. "If there's someone out there who needs help, I can't ignore it. The dog knows what he's doing. I trust him." Clara and Sam were silent for a moment, and then Clara nodded. "Be careful." George stepped into the snow, feeling the cold bite at his skin again. The dog was ahead, moving quickly, but always making sure George was following. As they walked, the cry became clearer. It was a sound of desperation, carried by the storm. George felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of fear and urgency. Finally, they reached a small area where the trees were more spaced out. There, between the snow-covered trunks, George saw a hunched figure. It was a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, hugging their knees and shaking uncontrollably. "My God!" George exclaimed, rushing toward the child. He knelt beside them, and the child looked up at him with wide, scared eyes. "Hey, it's okay," he said, trying to sound as calm as possible. "I'm here. You're safe now." The dog approached and sat next to them, as if guarding them both. George took off his coat and wrapped it around the child, feeling their small body still cold under the fabric. "How did you end up here?" George asked, trying to warm them with his hands. The child shook their head, crying softly. "I got lost. My mom. I can't find her." George felt his heart tighten. He looked around, but the snow made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. He knew there was no time to waste. "It's okay. We'll go back to the cabin. You'll be fine. I promise." He picked the child up, feeling how light they were. The dog led the way back, its steps sure in the snow being the only guide George had. When they finally reached the cabin, Clara and Sam opened the door urgently. Clara ran to help, wrapping the child in blankets and bringing them close to the fire. George sat next to them, still trying to process what had happened. He looked at the dog, who was lying down again, watching everything with its bright and calm eyes. "You knew, didn't you?" George said, looking at him. "You knew they were out there." The dog just stared back, but George felt as if he had received an answer. He looked at Clara and Sam, then at the child, who was now calmer. For the first time in a long time, he felt something deep and true. He wasn't just surviving. He was alive. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire and the presence of Clara, Sam, and the child brought a sense of relief that George hadn't felt in years. The girl, still wrapped in blankets, was finally asleep, with Clara by her side, offering gentle words every time she stirred. George, however, couldn't relax. He was sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness. The dog was next to him, its eyes fixed on him, as if waiting for something. "I did what I had to do, didn't I?" George asked, almost as if seeking approval. The dog didn't answer, of course, but its presence seemed more like a question than a confirmation. Sam approached with a cup of hot coffee and sat beside George. "You saved that girl, George. If it weren't for you and that dog, she probably wouldn't be alive right now." George nodded slowly, but his mind was elsewhere. "I still wonder, why now? Why today? I've spent years living in emptiness, hiding, and now, all of this. Clara, you, the dog, the girl. It's like something's testing me." Sam chuckled softly. "Or maybe it's Christmas reminding you of what you've forgotten." George gave a short laugh, without humor. "Forgotten how to care? How to live? Is that it?" Sam paused for a moment before responding. "No, you've forgotten that even when things seem lost, there's always something or someone that needs you. And you, George, still have a lot to offer." Sam's words hit him deeply. He looked at the sleeping child, then at Clara, who was adjusting the blankets around her. Something inside George stirred, like an ember beginning to reignite. He sighed, running his hands through his gray hair. "I just never thought I'd have something to fight for again." The dog suddenly got up, walked to the door, and stopped there. It looked at George and let out a low, insistent bark. "Again?" George said, standing up with a look of disbelief. "You want to go out again? Now?" Clara looked at him. "If he's asking, maybe it's important." George laughed nervously. "You two are so calm about this, like it's normal for this dog to drag me into the snow every time." "Maybe because it is," Sam replied, with an encouraging smile. George looked at the dog, then at Clara and Sam. He sighed deeply and grabbed his coat again. "All right, boy. But this is the last time." He opened the door, and the cold wind hit him again. But this time he was prepared. The dog rushed out quickly, moving with a determination that George already recognized. He followed the animal once more, the two of them disappearing into the darkness of the night. The snow was heavy, but the dog seemed unfazed. George struggled to keep up, but something inside him urged him to keep going. He felt like this moment was different, more decisive. Finally, they reached a small clearing. George stopped, out of breath, looking around. Everything was silent, except for the sound of the storm in the distance. "What do you want me to see here, boy?" he asked, his voice heavy with fatigue and frustration. The dog looked at him, then slowly turned to a solitary tree in the center of the clearing. It wasn't big or decorated like the one in the previous clearing, but on its branches, there was something that caught George's attention. He approached, hesitant, and saw that hanging from one of the branches was a star-shaped ornament. He carefully picked it up and noticed that it was engraved with Margaret's name. George stood still, staring at the star as silent tears ran down his face. He didn't know how this was possible, but there, in that moment, he felt like Margaret was with him. "You brought this to me?" he asked the dog, who watched him patiently. George pressed the star to his chest, closing his eyes. He felt a warmth spread inside, as if something had been restored. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't regret. It was peace. "Thank you, boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The dog barked softly, then turned and began walking back to the cabin. George looked at the star one more time before following him, feeling that, for the first time in years, he had found something he hadn't even realized he was looking for. A reason to keep going. George returned to the cabin with slow but steady steps. The star-shaped ornament was still in his hands, and every time he looked at it, he felt the warmth of that special connection with Margaret. It was as if she had found a way to tell him that she had never truly been far away. When he entered, Clara and Sam greeted him with curious looks. Clara noticed the expression on his face, a mix of sadness, relief, and something new, perhaps determination. "Is everything all right, George?" she asked, walking toward him. He held up the star, his eyes glistening with restrained emotion. "I found this. It had Margaret's name on it. I don't know how, but I think she wanted me to see this." Clara and Sam exchanged a glance, understanding the weight of the moment without needing any explanation. Sam nodded slowly. "Sometimes we get signs when we need them the most. It seems like this one was for you." George sat down at the table, carefully placing the star next to the empty plate of cookies. He looked at Clara and Sam, then at the child, who was still peacefully asleep on the couch, wrapped in blankets. For a moment, he sat in silence, as if gathering courage to speak. "I've spent so much time pushing everything away," he began, his voice rough, "letting the world move on without me. But now I see I was wrong. Margaret wanted me to live, to do something with the time I have left. And today, here with you, I think I've finally understood." Clara smiled, but waited for him to continue. "I want to be part of something again. I want to honor what she believed in, what she always did. I don't know exactly how, but I want to start now." Sam crossed his arms and leaned forward. "And what do you have in mind, George?" George looked around the cabin, observing the Christmas tree, the cookies on the table, and the child asleep, saved from the cold by Clara and Sam's generosity. "I want to bring back the Christmas I lost. I want to create something where people feel like I did today, welcomed, remembered, connected. I want to do this in memory of Margaret. And if you'll help me, I think I can start here." Clara placed her hand on George's shoulder, her smile full of approval. "We're with you, George. Whatever you need, we'll do it together." He felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he didn't just want to live. He had a plan. He would help Clara and Sam expand what they already did, perhaps organizing dinners for lonely people or offering a space where everyone could share stories, laughter, and the spirit of Christmas. He looked at the sleeping child and felt a pang in his heart. "But first, we have to find her family. She must be missing them, and they, her." Sam nodded. "Once the storm clears, we'll help you take her home. And when that's done, we'll start planning this special Christmas." George looked at the dog, now lying beside the fire, calmly watching. "And I think this guy here has already taught me everything I needed to know about finding the right path." They all laughed, but George knew he was serious. The dog had guided him not just physically but emotionally, helping him find something he thought was lost forever, a purpose. As they sat together around the table, discussing ideas for what was to come, George felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just relief or peace, it was excitement. He was looking forward to what was to come, to what he could do, to the memories still to be made. And as the snow continued to fall outside, he realized that, finally, he was ready to move forward. The cabin was silent, except for the sound of the crackling fire and the wind still howling outside. George watched the child sleep, her face finally relaxed after so much fear and cold. He felt a mix of relief and responsibility. Saving that girl had been a turning point, but it also made him aware that his new plan would require more from him than just words. At the table, Clara and Sam were discussing the best way to help the girl find her family once the storm calmed down. George listened attentively, but his mind was occupied with another matter. He knew that to move forward, to truly honor Margaret and do something meaningful, he would have to let go of what remained of his old life, the loneliness he had embraced for so long. After a while, Clara looked at him. "You've been really quiet, George. Something on your mind?" He took a deep breath before responding. "Yes, I've been thinking. To do this, to help turn this place into a real refuge, I'm going to need to leave my house. That place, it's like it's frozen in time, stuck in Margaret's memory. I thought staying there would keep me connected to her, but now I realize it just keeps me trapped." Clara nodded, immediately understanding the weight of that decision. "You mean you're going to move here?" George looked around the cabin, observing the warmth and life that seemed to pulse in every corner. "If you'll have me, yes. I want to be part of what you're building here. I think Margaret would like that. But for that, I'll need to leave some things behind. It won't be easy, but I think it's the only way." Sam placed a firm hand on George's shoulder. "That's no small thing, my friend. But if this is what you want, we'll be happy to have you here. And you don't have to do this alone." George smiled faintly, but his mind was still restless. He thought about the house he and Margaret had shared for so many years, all the objects and memories that were there. He knew he couldn't take everything with him, but he didn't want to completely erase that chapter of his life either. "My house is full of memories," he said, almost to himself. "Every corner, every piece of furniture. It's part of who I am. But I think I need to find a new meaning for those things. Maybe give away what I can to those who need it. Turn what was mine into something that can help others." Clara smiled. "That's a beautiful idea, George, and very generous. I'm sure Margaret would be proud." He nodded, feeling a mix of relief and pain. It was hard to let go of what he had carefully kept, but at the same time, he knew it would set him free to move forward. Sam, practical as always, chimed in. "We can help with that. Once the storm passes, we'll go to your house together. And when you're ready, we'll turn this place into something that honors her memories while creating new stories." George smiled, feeling for the first time that he wasn't alone in this decision. He looked at the dog, who was watching him with its ever-attentive eyes. "And you, boy? You'll keep guiding me, won't you?" The dog wagged its tail, as if confirming, and lay back down, looking satisfied. As the night went on, George felt the weight of his decision, but also the freedom that came with it. He knew it would be hard to say goodbye to his old life, but at the same time, he was starting to understand that letting go wasn't about forgetting. It was about transforming, carrying the past in a way that allowed him to fully live in the present. He looked out the window, seeing the snow finally begin to die down. Tomorrow would be a new day, and he was ready to take the next step, no matter how hard it might be. The day broke slowly, with the first rays of sunlight breaking the ice from the previous night. The storm had subsided, but the world around still lay covered in a thick layer of snow, as if everything was suspended in time. George got up early, but the weight of his decision still lingered. He looked at the child that Clara and Sam were helping prepare for her return to her family. They had managed to contact local services, and someone was on their way to take her home. The girl smiled shyly at George as she drank her hot coffee, and he smiled back, feeling a pang of happiness for having helped her. But when George thought about what came next, going back to his house to face his past and start over, a wave of doubt hit him. He had always known that leaving the house he shared with Margaret would be difficult, but now, with the idea so concrete, it felt unbearable. He walked outside the cabin, watching the quiet clearing. The dog followed him, as always, but this time didn't lead. He simply sat beside George, quietly waiting. "I don't know if I can do this," George said, his voice rough. "Everything seems so clear here, so right? But when I think about going back there, it's like all the progress I've made disappears. That house, it's like it's all that's left of her." He rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the tears build up. "What if I can't say goodbye? What if I can't move on? Maybe I've been fooling myself. Maybe I'm not ready to change." The dog looked at him with calm eyes, but did nothing. He didn't bark, didn't move, just stayed there, a silent presence. George began walking in circles, speaking more to himself than to the dog. "Everyone says it's easy to move on, but they don't know what it's like to lose someone like that. It's like I lost a part of me, a part I'll never be able to replace." The dog tilted its head slightly but remained silent. "Margaret believed in me," George continued, his voice now choking. "But can I believe in myself? Can I be someone without her?" He stopped walking, looking at the snow around him. His eyes now filled with tears he didn't try to hold back. "I miss her so much. Sometimes, I still wake up thinking she's in the kitchen, making coffee, and then I remember. And it all comes back again." George dropped to his knees in the snow, holding his head in his hands. It was as if the weight of everything was finally crashing down on him, leaving him breathless. The dog stood up and walked over to him, placing its head gently on his lap. George felt the warmth of the touch and looked at him, tears running down his face. "Do you think I can do it, boy? Do you think I can say goodbye to her without losing her completely?" The dog didn't move, but its eyes seemed to say, "You're already doing it." George took a deep breath, feeling the cold penetrate his lungs. He ran his hand over the dog's head, absorbing the calm that this presence always seemed to offer. He knew this was the hardest moment, the moment to accept that, in order to move forward, he needed to let the past rest in peace. After a while, he got up, still feeling heavy but a little more grounded. The dog followed him back to the cabin, where Clara and Sam were waiting. Clara looked at him with concern. "George, are you all right?" He nodded slowly. I'm trying. It still hurts, but I think I'm ready to try." Sam smiled, placing a hand on George's shoulder. "That's all you need to do. One step at a time." As they prepared to leave, George looked one last time at the cabin and the people who had reignited something inside him. He knew that the darkest moment wasn't the pain of leaving Margaret behind, but the struggle to believe that he could still live. And somehow, with each tear shed and each step taken, he began to see the light. The walk to George's house was long, but surprisingly calm. The snow still covered everything around, but the sky was clear, with the sun reflecting off the ice and creating small sparkles that seemed to dance between the trees. Clara and Sam walked beside George, while the dog led the group, always moving ahead as it always did. George felt the weight of the moment in every step. He knew that by opening the door to his house, he would be confronting years of memories, years of isolation. But this time, he wasn't alone. When they arrived, George stopped at the entrance. The house looked exactly as he had left it. The faded paint, the snow-covered porch, and the closed windows were a reflection of his own life. Stagnant, waiting for a purpose that never seemed to arrive. He looked at Clara and Sam, who waited patiently, and then at the dog, who was sitting, looking at him as if saying, "It's your turn now." George took a deep breath and climbed the steps. He held the doorknob for a moment, hesitating, before finally opening it. The familiar smell of the house, a mixture of aged wood and old memories, enveloped him immediately. He stood at the entrance, looking at the dust-covered furniture and the pictures hanging on the walls. Clara entered right behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, George. You're in control." He nodded, swallowing hard. Slowly, he walked into the living room, his eyes landing on an armchair in the corner of the room. It was Margaret's favorite spot. She used to spend hours reading or sewing there, always with a peaceful smile on her face. George sat on the couch, feeling a lump form in his throat. "It's like she's still here," he said quietly. Clara sat beside him, and in a way, she is. Not in the things, but in what you feel when you remember her. He looked at her, realizing the weight of those words. Clara was right. Margaret was present, not in the objects around, but in the memories he carried with him. With a deep sigh, George stood up and walked over to a shelf in the corner of the room. There was a box there, covered in dust. He opened it carefully and saw that it was filled with Christmas ornaments. Stars, hearts, bells, and at the top, Margaret's favorite ornament, a porcelain angel with golden wings. He held the angel for a moment, feeling the tears fall. But this time, they weren't just from sadness. They were from acceptance. "Clara, Sam," he said, his voice a little firmer. "I want these ornaments to be part of the cabin. I want them to keep bringing joy to someone, just like they did for us." Clara smiled. "That's a beautiful idea, George. Margaret would be proud." He nodded and began sorting the items in the box, deciding which ones could be donated and which ones he would keep as memories. Each piece he touched brought a memory, but instead of paralyzing him, those memories encouraged him to move forward. As he worked, Sam began to rearrange the furniture, helping prepare the house for its next phase, turning it into a space to welcome others, just as Clara and Sam had done with the cabin. George knew it would be a long process, but he was ready. The dog, who had been quiet until then, stood up and walked over to George. It touched his leg with its nose, drawing his attention. George looked at it and smiled. "You really knew what you were doing, didn't you?" The dog wagged its tail, and George laughed, feeling a relief he hadn't felt in years. As the sun began to set, George looked around the room. There was work to do, but he no longer felt alone. He had Clara, Sam, and even that mysterious dog by his side. More importantly, he had something to fight for. He picked up the porcelain angel and placed it carefully on the mantel. Then, he turned to the others. "It's time to start decorating, don't you think?" This place deserves a real Christmas." Clara and Sam smiled, and the trio began to work. The dog watched, as always, but there was something different about it now. It seemed satisfied, as if its mission was complete. And in that moment, while George hung the lights and ornaments that once brought so much joy to his life, he realized he was starting to build something new. Margaret would always be with him, but now he was ready to truly live. The following days were intense for George. He and Sam spent hours cleaning and rearranging the house, while Clara worked on transforming Margaret's ornaments into something that could shine in a new context. Every movement, every small task, seemed to have a greater purpose than just preparing the house. It was as if each gesture helped George to free himself, piece by piece, from the weight he had been carrying. The little girl they had rescued had already been safely returned to her family, and the heartfelt gratitude from her mother echoed in George's mind. "You saved my daughter. I can never thank you enough." These words stayed with him, a reminder that even amid his pain, he had found a reason to act. Now, the living room had been transformed. The fireplace glowed with a welcoming warmth, and the Christmas lights blinked softly on the tree that Sam and Clara helped set up. At the top, Margaret's porcelain angel occupied its place gracefully, like a guardian of this new beginning. George stood in the center of the room, observing the finished work. It felt strange, but he felt a peace he hadn't felt in years. He looked at Clara and Sam, who were sitting at the table, laughing and sharing stories. They had become more than just friends. They were his new family. "Well, looks like you did it, George," Clara said, with a warm smile. He nodded, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked over to the fireplace and picked up a frame he had placed there. It was a picture of him and Margaret, taken at a Christmas many years ago. He looked at the picture for a moment before placing it back in its place. "Yeah, I did," he finally said, his voice firmer. "But not alone." The dog, who had been lying near the tree, lifted its head and looked at him. George smiled and walked over to it, kneeling down to pet its head. "You were my guide, boy. I don't know where you came from, but thank you." The dog wagged its tail, but there was something in its eyes that seemed different. It was as if it understood that its mission was complete. "So, what's next?" Sam asked, raising his cup of tea. George turned to him, with a sparkle in his eyes that hadn't been seen in a long time. "What's next is helping more people. This house won't just be mine. It will be a place for those in need, just like I was. A refuge." Clara smiled, proud. Margaret would be so happy to hear that. George looked at the angel on the tree, feeling the weight of his words. Yeah, she would. This is for her, but it's also for me, for all of us. They spent the rest of the night together, talking and planning how they could turn the house into a place to welcome others who needed a little hope. George felt alive again, as if each idea and every plan were small steps towards something greater. When the night came to an end, Clara and Sam left, promising to return the next day to continue helping. George was left alone in the room, except for the dog, which was lying near the fireplace. He sat on the couch and looked at the angel on the tree. "Margaret, I think you knew all along that I needed this, didn't you?" He smiled to himself, feeling the warmth of the fireplace on his face. "Thank you for never giving up on me." The dog barked softly, and George laughed. "You too, boy. You too." As the night went on, the house no longer felt empty. It was filled with memories, but also with new possibilities. George knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time in years, he was eager to face them. And as he closed his eyes, sitting in the warmth of the fireplace, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, gently illuminating the living room. George slowly opened his eyes, feeling the warmth of the fireplace still active, even though the flames had diminished to embers. He rubbed his face, taking a deep breath, while the house around him seemed peaceful and alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. He looked at the angel on top of the tree, remembering how Margaret used to place it there so carefully every Christmas. The longing was still there, but now it was accompanied by something new: gratitude. George got up and walked over to the window. Outside, the snow sparkled under the sun, covering the world like a pure, renewing blanket. He remembered the journey he had been through, The desperation in the middle of the storm, the clearing with the illuminated tree, the unexpected help from the dog, and the moment he found the star with Margaret's name. Every step of that journey seemed to have a purpose, a lesson he needed to learn. Clara and Sam arrived shortly after, bringing boxes of supplies and ornaments to continue the work on the house. George greeted them with a genuine smile, something that seemed almost impossible for him just a few weeks ago. As they worked together, Clara asked, "George, what would you say you've learned from all of this?" George paused for a moment, reflecting. He held an ornament in his hand, a small bell that Margaret loved to hang on the tree, and looked at Clara. "I learned that pain doesn't have to be the end of everything, that it can teach us to appreciate what we had even more and find the strength to move forward, and that someone's love, even after they're gone, can still guide us." Clara smiled, nodding. "That's beautiful, George, and very true." George continued, now with more confidence in his voice. "I also learned that no one can do this alone. I spent so much time isolated, thinking I had to handle everything by myself. But that's not living. It was you, this dog, even that little girl, who helped me realize that what really matters is what we share with others." Sam, who was adjusting the fireplace, looked at George and said with a smile, "Well, looks like you found the spirit of Christmas again, my friend." George chuckled softly. "Yeah, I think I did. But it's not just Christmas. It's more than that. It's the idea that there's always a new beginning, even when we think everything is lost." They spent the day decorating the house, bringing back the sparkle it seemed to have lost. George felt that every light, every ornament, and every conversation was a small victory. One more step toward turning that space into a place where other people could find comfort and hope. At the end of the day, Clara, Sam, and George sat around the table, sharing a simple meal. George raised a glass of punch and said, "Margaret always said that Christmas was about finding joy, no matter where we were or what we had. Today, I feel like I finally understand what she meant." They toasted, and George looked at the dog, who was lying near the fireplace, as always. He smiled at the animal, feeling that, in some way, it knew exactly how much it had helped. As the night fell, George walked over to the tree and looked at the angel on top. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you, Margaret," he whispered, "for never giving up on me." He returned to the table, feeling lighter, more complete. The lessons he had learned weren't just about moving forward, but about embracing what he still had and turning it into something meaningful. Christmas night arrived, and George's house was completely transformed. The lights on the tree twinkled softly, the ornaments shone in their places, and the fireplace radiated warmth throughout the room. Clara and Sam were busy in the kitchen, helping prepare a simple feast, while George made the finishing touches on the table. He looked around and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. "This is what Christmas is supposed to be," he whispered, not to anyone in particular. The dog, who was sitting near the fireplace, wagged its tail, as if agreeing. Soon after, guests began to arrive. Clara and Sam had spread the word around the community, and soon the room was filled with people. Lonely neighbors, young people far from their families, and even the mother and brother of the little girl George had rescued. The room filled with laughter and conversation, sounds George hadn't heard in his home in years. As everyone settled in, George raised a glass of punch to make a brief toast. "I just wanted to say thank you to each of you. This Christmas isn't special because of the decorations or the food. It's special because we're here together. After so much time, I've realized that Christmas isn't about what we've lost, but about what we can still build." Everyone toasted, and George felt a sincere joy as he looked around at the people near him. He knew he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. Clara smiled at him and said, "You've created something incredible here, George." "This is just the beginning." George nodded. "Yes, it's just the beginning. This place will be a refuge for those in need, an open house to bring hope to those who think they have nowhere to go. It's what I received, and now I want to share it." As the night went on, the aromas of cinnamon, ginger, and spices filled the air. George realized that the food was more than just a detail. It was a way to bring people together, to create special moments. He turned to Clara and said, Margaret always said that food has a way of bringing memories to the surface, of making people feel at home. I think she was right. Clara smiled. Well, that couldn't be more true. By the way, did you know there are many simple and heartwarming Christmas recipes that can turn any gathering into a special moment? George raised an eyebrow, curious. Don't tell me. Clara nodded enthusiastically. Yes, it's one of the secrets to creating those memories that warm the heart. Simple recipes, but full of flavor and meaning. And if you want to learn some of them, I have something that can help. Sam appeared from across the room and added, "Oh, yes. She's talking about an amazing ebook called Sweet Christmas Memories. Simple recipes to warm the soul. It's perfect for creating moments like this." George laughed, with a glint of curiosity in his eyes. "Now you've got me interested. Where can I find that?" Clara responded with a smile. "Oh, it's easy. The link is in the pinned comment. Anyone can access it now and start transforming their Christmases too." As the guests tasted the cookies and chatted happily, George looked around and felt a deep sense of gratitude. He knew that the Christmas spirit wasn't just in a tree or in the decorations, but in the little things we share. A meal, a story, a smile. And in that moment, he knew that his journey wasn't just a happy ending, but the beginning of something much bigger. Transform your Christmas too with simple and memorable recipes. Access the ebook Sweet Christmas Memories. Simple recipes to warm the soul now. The link is in the pinned comment. Don't miss any videos. Subscribe now and let us know what you thought of this video in the comments.